Thank you, and don't feel bad about the name. My boss hasn't said it right in 3 years, so that's okay. It's just the way it goes. I feel like Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, my name is Homer Simpson. Anyway. So the Ontario Chamber represents 60,000 businesses across this great province of ours, about 17% of GDP, and about 2 million employed, if you will. I joined the Chamber 2.5 years ago, and I was put in charge of basically defining and then driving an agenda for the province, an economic agenda for the province. Basically, I was tasked with answering a basic question. And the question is what steps and policy actions are required to ensure that Ontario emerges stronger from this period of economic transition? And I think Gary did a pretty good job of defining a huge element of the so-called problem, right, the problem definition. We're all aware of Ontario's debt and deficit situation. We're approaching debt levels around 40% of GDP, which is not Greece, but we are on a bit of a slippery slope. Our net debt now is around $300 billion. At the same time, our growth projections are actually quite modest. So if you look at the Ontario Ministry of Finance's long-term report, we're expecting about 2% annual growth for the next 20 to 25 years, which really is insufficient if we're going to address our deficit the old-fashioned way, and that's just grow our way out of it. So that, plus the fact that there is a growing demand for certain services, particularly social services. We know that 14% of our population today is of retirement age. By 2035, it is going to be 25%. So, a perfect storm. Fiscal capacity, fiscal constraints, followed by growing demand for services. The only way we can really respond to that, and that's, I think that very many people would agree with me, is to enhance productivity in key areas of where government is involved. And Gary said it, I think, very well. We need to think about how we can do more with less. I think most people will agree with me in the problem definition. When I sort of do the roadshow on this piece of research, everyone's get a lot of affirmative head nodding. Either that or they're bored, but whatever. So as part of this, you know, we looked at this sort of this productivity issue in government, the need to increase productivity, if you will. And so what we did is we sort of defined what we thought the research question was, and then what we did is we sought the advice of an advisory panel. It was chaired by Dwight Duncan and John Capobianco. We conducted a comprehensive literature review based on the fact that Ontario is about 4 to 5 years behind the austerity game, right? We know that the UK, states in the US, etc., have tackled this problem. It became much more acute much earlier for them. That offers us the opportunity to sort of learn from what they've been doing. So basically our literature review and our analysis was really much informed by international experience and best practice. And then we consulted with public and private sector experts. So this is where we landed. So based on our experience, and again, unsurprising given that Ontario is again 4 to 5 years from behind on the austerity game. And austerity is coming, I think we all know that, right? It's a bit of a laggard, if you will, when it comes to adopting innovative service delivery models. At one time, Ontario was a bit of a star, and I think of the horizontal integration of Service Ontario. I think of the delegated authorities for some regulated professions and so on and so forth. We were a bit of a first mover, and then things sort of stopped. Again, one of the advantages is that we have an opportunity to learn from other jurisdictions about what steps they've taken to sort of address this challenge, this need for greater productivity, i.e. doing more with less. So what we've seen is basically a secular use of so-called alternative service delivery. And our argument is that increased use of alternative service delivery at the provincial, federal, and also municipal levels would inject a bit of a dynamicism into Ontario's public service economy. Okay? So I'm going to get very esoteric for about 5 to 10 minutes. I'm asking you to bear, less than that, about 5 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. I'm asking you to bear with me, and then I'm going to get into the practical. So what is alternative service delivery? Well, it is the process of public service transformation, whereby governments partner with the private sector and the nonprofit sector in the delivery of public services. Now, some people say, what do you mean? This is just outsourcing. The reality is that, particularly in the UK, Australia, and certain parts of the US, for example, is ASD is really much more than so-called outsourcing. Outsourcing is just one place, if you will, on the so-called continuum of complexity, right, of ASD arrangements. So ASD is a very simple form. Outsourcing is a very simple form of ASD, and then we get into models such as more complex, things like mutuals, where employees form their own corporations and then build a state, social impact bonds, et cetera. The rest of the world is doing tremendous experimentation under this ASD umbrella. Okay? So again, we need to think of what's happening in terms of the other jurisdictions, the way they're partnering with the private and nonprofit sectors. Again, it's this continuum of complexity. And it's not just outsourcing. And I'm going to explore that a little bit more as we move along. Okay? And again, our argument is, again, if the ambition is to do more with less, ASD is part of the answer. Okay? It's not the complete answer, but it's part of the answer. Okay? And so increased use of alternative service delivery would inject dynamicism into Ontario's public service economy. So what do we mean by the public service economy? Public service economy, again, it's kind of an esoteric concept, but it actually is very, very real. The public sector, by most counts, is the most important sector of the economy. It accounts for around 25% of GDP. That's larger in Ontario than the manufacturing sector and the financial services sector combined. Okay? The public service economy is really the mix of public, private, and not-for-profit providers who deliver public services. And the key is the mix. Okay? And in fact, much of government services, as you know probably better than anyone else in this province, is delivered by third parties. Think of OHIP. OHIP is actually, your OHIP card, your health card, is actually a form of a voucher. Right? You decide which doctor you're going to. They swipe the card, they bill the state. It really is, in one way or another, a voucher. Think of the training universe, right? And I'm sure many of you have some control over and have relationships with third-party providers, nonprofits primarily, in the training space. Now, the key contention behind this so-called public service economy notion is that government has already created markets. Again, the OHIP is a voucher. Again, third-party delivery of training, third-party deliverer of immigrant settlement services, right? But if you begin to think of the public service and economy as an economy, it sort of shifts your lens a little bit, okay? Where in the UK, again, they've done quite a bit of thinking about this, and you know, government creates markets, often unintentionally, but it's really passive in the so-called markets and market design. And the incentives that it creates hasn't given thought to the appropriate mix of, you know, government versus nonprofit versus private sector delivery. The outcome, of course, is a failure in many instances, not all instances, but failure in many instances to deliver value for money. Okay? Now, if go back to the original problem definition, is if the goal is to do more with less, if the part of the problem is also this low growth sort of trap that we're in right now, getting better value for money, getting more responsive public services, designing better public service markets, the impact on the economy, but the impact on the value that we provide in can be electric. Okay? So, how does government go about unlocking the public service economy? Okay? Through competition and contestability, and the delivery of design of public services through ASD, and the better design of markets that already exist. Now, at some point, I know about 50% of this room is thinking that I'm a right-wing, Tea Party nutbar. I accept that. But I always tell us, so I teach at the School of Public Policy, and I always tell my students, and I'm somewhat of a committed social democrat, right? I actually believe in the value of public services, and my goal and my thinking about this, my academic work, is actually preserving the state's capacity to deliver needed public services in a context that is very real and that's not going away. And that is, again, I would say not dire, but difficult fiscal circumstances. Okay? So my goal, and the goal of the people who sort of got together and started thinking about this public service economy is about preserving the state's capacity to deliver vital services in a context of real demographic pressures and growing demand. At the same time, we're very aware, cognizant of the fact that not every service is suitable for an ASD arrangement. There are some services which are inherently governmental, right, that serve vast public goods, that where a role for a nonprofit or a private sector provider is inappropriate. The intrinsically governmental, as it were. But ASD can be attractive for some areas and can deliver value, and international experience shows it. What can ASD do? Well, it can be a source of capital, business models and transformation. The classic example I use in every talk that I give is OHIP back office, right? The Ontario Health Insurance Plan, or whatever it stands for, the technology is processing claims from doctors and translating that into payments is 5 decades old. And the IP, intellectual property, is about to retire because there's really only 4 or 5 people who actually know how the system works, and they're retiring. So we have a problem, and the problem is government needs a whackload of cash to fix it, and it needs new business models, right? The private sector, I would argue, is a perfect place to deliver both. And in fact, Ontario is one of the few jurisdictions in the world that actually does its own back office processing for health claims. BC underwent an ASD model about 4 or 5 years ago, or actually slightly more than that, and it's had fantastic results. Okay? Diversity and innovation. Okay? Bringing contestability, new models, new benchmarking, right? ASD is a fabulous tool for understanding how much public services cost, but also to, again, import new business models into areas of public service. It also shifts the lens from producer capture, which is kind of an esoteric term, but the notion of whenever there's a monopoly, private sector or public sector, the producer will act in its own interests, not necessarily in the interest of the consumer. Okay? Inject a little diversity, you get much more customer focus. And again, demonstrable results. And we're all aware of the sob stories. We're all aware of experiments that failed, and I'm going to talk about a few of those in a few minutes. Okay? But the results have been very, very positive in very, very many instances. And again, in areas where there have been areas where they haven't been positive, but that offers us the opportunity to learn. Okay. So some caveats, some responses to common concerns. Okay. So when people think of outsourcing, they think of, well, the only way you're actually going to save money is through wage suppression and union busting. Okay. Now, in simple outsourcing, often that is how cost savings are delivered, through suppressing of wages. Not union busting, but suppressing of wages. But again, as you move along the continuum complexity, less and less the cost savings are achieved through wage suppression, and more is it through new business models, right? Is it through infusion of technology, so on and so forth. That's where the cost savings lies, again, in these complex models. Second of all, it's like, people use the P word, privatization. It's just government abdicating, right? Or they point out to the examples, and then this is the example I'm forced to talk about most, is the orange example, where you hand it off to a third party and they pocket money and so on and so forth. I want to be transparent. Orange is not a failure of the model, of the delivery model. It's actually a failure of governance. It was the failure to design proper oversight of that model. And in fact, what happened at Orange took a very, like a 19th century sort of airline, ambulance service and transformed it into one of the best in the world, right? Again, this is not an ideological exercise. ASD is not appropriate for every service area, but it must be supported by business cases and evidence, right? And again, very transparent about this. This is not an ideological project. It's about, is ASD a means to deliver more with less? More with less? Is it a means to actually deliver better value for clients? Okay. Agreements can be designed to protect public interest, and a lot of people say, well, what about profit, private sector or they can pocket the money and walk away with runaway profits. The 407 is actually cited as an example, but there's been tons of innovation with respect to master service agreements. So, for example, windfall protections, right? For cap on profit, profit sharing, etc. There are tons of innovations in the master service agreement process at our country. Now, there's actually one in Ontario, and Paul Daglish is going to talk about in a minute, is actually in the drive test example, which we're going to have a breakout, is actually the provider actually pays for the cost of regulating and oversight, right? And profit, the P word, the second P word, profit. Again, you can design windfall protection, but the one thing I would say about profit, particularly and again, we're talking about ASD to the private sector. Profit is the reward for innovation, and profit represents return on capital. And if you think about the challenges that government faces right now, again, we're talking about the need for innovation, and in a context of capital shortage. Okay. These are two things that government desperately needs, okay? So again, I mean, it's up to the government, it's up to conduct a business case to decide whether or not it's the private sector or the nonprofit sector that, again, is best placed to deliver a certain outcome. And so during the breakout sessions, we're going to introduce you to three examples. One is the Peel Region Child Care Services. Second is drive test. Fabulous example, a made in Ontario example. You used to have to wait something like 9 months to get your driver's license to get a test. Now it's down to a matter of a few weeks, and the service is seamless. Health Insurance BC is another example. Janet Menard is going to talk about the region of Peel and what they've done in terms of child care services. We're talking about taking money, lowering the cost of delivery, and reprofiling that money back to the client so you can offer, again, more for less. So, let's go a little bit into the weeds. How does government deliver benefits and protect public interests? Well, there are three sort of broad categories, and one is to build capacity to steward markets, another is adopt new approaches to procurement, deal oversight, and risk management, and the third is to work constructively with public sector unions. Now, there is a paper available on our website, the Ontario OCC.ca, that provides much, much more detail, and our work is going to continue in this area, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. In terms of building capacity, certainly we're advocating that government writ large. For employers, there's really only one government. They don't distinguish between what the federal government does, what the provincial government. If you ask my members, they'll tell you about 8% of them, it's the federal government that actually delivers health care. They have no concept of what role. But certainly we're looking for a center of expertise, an institution where we can learn what the other countries are doing, what other jurisdictions are doing, and then start to put some of that in practice in Ontario. We need better data value for money analysis and cost drivers. Now, in one of the plenaries today, you're going to hear from SAS, which is a company that is basically ruling the big data world, but using data and analytics to understand your baselines. Okay? There'll be more on that later. We need to transition from a mentality of moving away from procurement, the third P word, if you will, to so-called commissioning. Okay? And there's an important subtle differences here. Procurement is basically procuring goods at the lowest possible cost. Okay? The reality is the UK has moved to a so-called commissioning model. And a commissioning model enables much more collaboration with third parties in the design of solutions, if you will. Often it's the case that government's not even aware of the solutions that are available to it with respect to service delivery and service delivery transformation. Okay? But the procurement models as exist today don't allow government to really understand the suite of options, unsolicited proposals, and so on and so forth. Okay? And again, procurement will lead you to one solution, and that is outsourcing, right? And to quote someone much smarter about this stuff than I am, if the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Okay? And again, in Ontario, in Canada, we tend to think of these relationships as across a matrix of one, and that is outsourcing. Right? The range of options in international experience is so much more diverse than that. Okay? And again, the Master Service Agreement. The Master Service Agreement, there's been incredible innovations in Master Service Agreements across the globe. I mean, we're all aware of payments by results, but it's in terms of the design of oversight, the design of governance for these types of deals. It's incredible. We need to transition from deal monitoring to governance, right? Move away from risk management towards, not risk management, risk mitigation to risk management and value creation. And we need to do a better job of re-engineering retained organizations. I'm firmly of the belief that when these types of deals fail, and I'm thinking of the Orange being an example, is because government hasn't built the capacity to follow through in terms of its responsibilities in the governance role. It's not built the capacity to monitor, to measure, and to, again, exercise effective oversight. And this is important because these types of deals aren't simply a cut and lift, right? You take a service, you throw it out there. Whoops, sorry, that's not word. You throw it. I'm a hand talker. That's one of my big liabilities as a public speaker. You throw it out there and let the deal work, and let the cards fall where they may. In fact, there's been a tremendous amount of work in the UK around building the capacity of government to actually monitor and properly oversee these deals. And they've created something called the Commissioning Academy. This is based in Whitehall, which is the equivalent of Cabinet Office in London. And they have this program that every senior policy and delivery civil servant has to go through around the art and science of commissioning properly. So I've got good news, because actually we have an idea about that and how we can bring that to Ontario. And you need to create more opportunities for public scrutiny. Okay? We need an early win strategy. We need generalizable tools. And this is the last point I'll sort of make in the how-to, is we need more opportunities for public scrutiny. We need to create an authorizing environment. So a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to I guess, debate Smokey Thomas at the Ontario Economic Summit on alternative service delivery. And quite understandably, the public sector unions are quite concerned about the so-called privatization agenda, and I'm doing my best to sort of assuage their concerns. But the reality is we need to create an environment that enables the public to understand precisely what the options are, but they also need to understand the outcome. So, for example, we need to create follow the money provisions so that if an ASD arrangement is created, the Auditor General can go in and understand exactly what the value is being delivered on the ground. We need the publication of results so that people understand what the outcomes are, and those outcomes should be located in a big centralized website for everyone to see so that the public can understand whether or not you're truly getting better value for money. That's a preamble to our discussion on labor relations. So the Ontario Public Service, OPSU, can't remember what the full name is, it came out with about a year ago with a 5-point plan for an employee transfer framework. Our goal here is not to think about, we're not secretly trying to plot the demise of the union movement or trying to bust the public sector unions, quite the opposite. And in fact, the most successful examples of ASD, and I think of the BC OHIP example, is all successor rights have been preserved, right? I met with someone yesterday from one of the big IT providers who's doing some outsourcing work and some ASD work in Canada and the US, and she says not one of our employees has experienced a decline in wages, right? But we agree that there's a need for a so-called transfer framework, and so one of our advocacy pieces is in this round, and this is a bargaining year for many of the unions, is to actually negotiate a transfer framework to enable these deals to occur. And also to create some pension trusts, which is a more technical issue that we can talk about in question period. But we think that there's actually a shared agenda here, that we can protect successor rights in many instances, but at the same time realize productivity gains, and again, this agenda about doing more with less. So, next steps. So we're in the process right now. So we've written 2 papers on this. We are convinced that herein lies part of the solution for, again, this fiscal situation that we're in and this need to do more with less. And now what we're going to do, and people keep asking us how. How do I undertake this? How do I know if this area is suitable for an ASD arrangement? So we're doing a case study with step-by-step guide for public servants. Okay, applicable at the provincial, federal, and municipal levels. So stay tuned for that. But the most exciting thing I think that we're doing is that we're importing the Commissioning Academy from Whitehall in the UK. So again, the UK is like 4 to 5 years ahead of us on this. They've made tons of mistakes, but they've also had tons of positive results. What can we learn from them? So we're in the process right now of negotiating the commissioning, if you will, of the UK Commissioning Academy and bringing them over for a very intensive training session with senior public servants as a pilot that maybe we expand and run on a permanent basis in Ontario. And I'd like to say that you're invited. We'd love to have you on board. And not only that, this Commissioning Academy won't be directed simply at the private sector, the public sector, but we're also going to bring the private sector along with us and also the non-profit sector and the unionized sector. Because the reality is for complex ASD, there are basically 3 lawyers in Toronto who know how to do this properly, right? So we need to build the capacity across the board. Now let me end on this. I think if I took a poll in the room and asked you whether or not you believe that public services will look dramatically different in 20 years than they do today, and I think everyone would say, or practically everyone, and those who say no, I'd like to debate you outside in the room in about 20 minutes, but I think we all agree, or the vast majority of us agree, the public services are going to look dramatically different 20 years from now, okay? And we need to start thinking of new innovative models. Right? New ways of delivering value for our clients, value for citizens, value for taxpayers. We're convinced that there's something here. It's not appropriate in every situation, not appropriate in every case, but I think that we need to begin in a more deliberate, in a more evidence-based way, thinking about what other countries have done and what innovations we can import, what mistakes we can avoid, and what successes we can replicate. It's going to happen. So let's get ahead of the curve, as it were. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Cheers.